You are now entering a dangerous liberty zone where God-given natural rights are held sacred and exercised. This is your warning. Tyranny, fascism, and censorship will not be tolerated. Ideas will be exchanged freely. Rigorous debate and open discourse is encouraged. If you are weak and your beliefs are fragile, you should leave now. Prepare yourself. We are now live on the Dangerous Liberty Podcast. What I'd like to do, Dana, is if you will, just introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your background before you got into all this, and then we'll go into it. And then what I kind of like to do is take a macro, just the 30-second, hey, here's what's going on, and then we can get into some of the finer details, the minutia of this, and then also hopefully we can talk about some of the evidence that you have. So from there, you know what, I definitely want to play devil's advocate with you as much as possible. Please. Answer some questions in my own mind, make it make sense for me as well as for the people that are jumping into and seeing some of this for the first time. Really where to start, Dane, is when you start going down these rabbit holes, one of the problems that I see is that things start getting very nebulous and very inflated, I guess, in many different, everything just starts branching out. I think it gets pretty overwhelming for most people, especially if this is your first time being exposed to anything like this. So Dane, I'll just leave it to you. If you will, Dane, just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you became aware of what was going on, and specifically from a big to small, we'll talk about what is going on and all the different offshoots and things that interwoven with this. So take it away.
Again, grateful to you, Gary, for your willingness to investigate this issue. This is not a battle I wanted. I'm not politically oriented. I've never been an activist. I grew up in smoggy Southern California and was very driven to escape that environment. Finally made it to Northern California in the middle of the wilderness. I live in the middle of a wilderness in every direction, off-grid, wind, hydro, solar. My home was on the cover of the world's largest renewable energy magazine. And I began to lose massive amounts of my solar PV uptake, photovoltaic uptake, as soon as I finished this project in this home. And it was from whatever these aircraft were emitting. And massive amounts, 60, 70, 80% of my solar power uptake. And I want to make clear for those who don't know, that's not 60, 70, 80% invisible light reduction. It's in photovoltaic power production. So you have to have direct, unobstructed sunlight for solar panels to work. I knew this couldn't be just condensation, and it would be very intermittent. You'd have grid patterns in the sky one day, nothing the next. And I was astounded, Gary, to find the mountain of data I found on geoengineering operations, solar radiation management, stratospheric aerosol injection, cloud albedo enhancement. Those are the terms for what some of the activist community calls chemtrails. And we avoid that term at geoengineeringwatch.org because it's a non-science term. It's the instant marginalization term for media, for elected officials. So we avoid that term. But I began to test my precipitation, Gary, and I didn't want to find climate engineering elements, starting with aluminum. I did not want to find that because I knew it would change the course of my life if I did. I did find it, first test of 7 ppb, parts per billion, of aluminum in the rain, which is high given my filtered forested location. There's nothing, no industry, nothing west of me until you hit Japan. I kept testing over the next 18 months. My test went as high as 3,450 ppb of aluminum in a single rain event. That's toxic rain. And bioavailable aluminum could not be in the rain unless it's been mined and refined and distributed, because although aluminum is a very abundant element in our strata, it does not exist in free form in nature, period. It's always bonded to other elements. It has to be mined and refined and dispersed in order for that to be in the precipitation. That's a primary element in climate engineering patents. So after these 18 months and all this testing and all this research, I was faced with a decision. Do I pretend I don't know? Which I can't do. My conscience won't let me look the other way, never. And that's been my last 20 years of my life, Gary.
If I can, let me back you up just a little bit. So you basically built a extremely, I guess we would call it a green home, right? So you had solar panels. It sounds like you had wind. What led you down that path to begin with?
Well, certainly I didn't want to be on the grid. I don't want to be on anybody else's umbilical. Sure. And that's prime, one. And two, in order to live in a wilderness area like this, you don't have that option anyway. And not that I wanted it. So in the case of, quote, renewable energy, which isn't, okay, this is part of my background, but let's not pretend this is renewable. A 900-foot tall wind turbine is not renewable. In fact, the lifespan of such a turbine is very limited And paradoxically, Gary, we have the whole quote green community pushing things like EVs,
right,
which are anything
very
but green.
Environment.
Very, very destructive for the environment. How hard is that to figure out? You got child laborers digging up minerals in third world countries, and then you got a charging station somewhere out in the middle of nowhere with a diesel generator behind it to generate the power to charge the EV.
That electricity is coming from, you know, coal and other non-clean energy forms.
Completely correct. So, in fact, for your followers, encourage them, if they really want to dig deep on that, search and view Planet of the Humans. That's a documentary about how renewable energy is. Highly, highly recommend that. In fact, in that documentary, at the 40-minute mark, they show an empty field of blowing sand in the middle of Mojave Desert, where the first solar plant of its type stood, the SEGS plant. I worked on that plant in the early 80s, and the design flaws were very obvious to me then. It's just simply smoke and mirrors to make people think this is, quote, renewable and we can keep doing this forever. It's total nonsense. So what I was going to point out, and when you have the entire green community, the AOCs and the Al Gores touting, quote, green energy, and they won't acknowledge climate engineering. Climate engineering radically diminishes all three forms of alternative energy. And that's what, let's call it alternative, not green, not renewable. And a solar panel is better than the outright incineration of carbon fuels, but it is certainly not renewable. So climate engineering, which the environmental community won't admit to, again, radically diminishing all three primary forms of alternative energy. So it's blocking the sun, which I expressed, and we have commercial solar farms that are producing half the design output because climate engineering is blocking direct sunlight.
Right.
Climate engineering, because it blocks direct sunlight, affects convection. So we have now, I don't know where your exact location is, Gary, but we have wind speeds now that are either all or nothing. We have straight line hurricane force winds all the time now, or nothing below high pressure domes, which are also engineered. So with wind turbines, if you double the design optimal output speed, you make nothing because the turbine has to be shut down to keep it from blowing apart. If you cut that speed in half, you make 1/8 the design output. So in either case, that turbine becomes dysfunctional. Hydropower. Right now, climate engineering is by far the single largest drought-inducing factor on planet Earth, period. Because it's blocking direct sunlight, it affects evaporation. Convection, again, affects wind, which reduces evaporation. So even though we have drought deluge scenarios right now on planet Earth, and that's a hallmark of climate engineering, creating those scenarios, either all or nothing, we have much more drought than we should have on a warming planet based on the laws of physics. Atmosphere holds 7% more moisture for every degree C of warming. It must rain more overall on a warming planet, but it's not. Why not? Because there's a factor we're not being told about, and that factor is climate engineering, and it is very effective at inducing drought, Gary. And so again, in the West here, we are literally completely drying up, everything dying, and nobody's talking about it.
Dane, what was your background? What was your profession? What did you do before you shifted gears and directed your attention to this issue?
I was in the electrical industry. I worked for Bechtel Power Corporation, amongst several other large companies. Bechtel's not an honorable company. It's like Halliburton. And at a young age, I saw supervisors and higher ups in the company that looked like they were honest men at one time and now clearly weren't. I didn't want to become that. I had the opportunity at a young age, even in my early 20s, to work in places like Saudi Arabia at six-figure incomes then, which was a lot of money in the early 80s.
Sure.
But I chose not to. I didn't want to become what I saw. And that's the last time I've worked for any major company. I've worked for myself since. I was a licensed contractor in California and Arizona. And I was retired when I came to Northern California. I was restoring habitat on a massive scale on the east side of Lake Shasta. I did 6 cost share programs restoring habitat, and that's restoring habitat after very destructive logging. Anybody who thinks logging is good for the environment needs to do some serious investigation, because it's not. And the reason the forests are burning, and that's another subject we can go into if you want, Gary, the biggest single factor for the incinerations we see happening are not because we're not cutting down enough trees, not because we're not thinning the forests. It's because of climate engineering and the drought factor, which I mentioned, and the incendiary dust, which these particles are. Aluminum is such an effective incendiary, and with your military background, I know you must know this. Yeah. Aluminum nanoparticles are used in thermite. incredibly effective incendiary. It's coating forest foliage, a forest floor. It's destroying the ozone layer as well. From so many directions, Gary, the road leads right back to climate engineering and the downstream consequences it creates.
So we're talking about climate engineering. We're basically talking about at least an attempt to manage, control, and manipulate the weather. So ultimately, Dane, number one, what is the primary motive, the driving factor behind these efforts? We can talk about the direct effects that you've already touched on, the negative effects of those. But what is the motive? Is there this good intention where it's just leading us down to these secondary and tertiary negative events? Or explain to me, or at least your thoughts on that part.
Super important core question. Thank you. Let's start with the stated purpose of solar radiation management is to try to, with reflective particles dispersed from aircraft, block some of the sun's incoming thermal radiation to slow down the warming of the planet. We have the entire global climate science community discussing this issue. We have every government around the globe discussing this issue. None of them admitting to the elephant in the room, because once you intervene in the climate system, once you derail the climate system, every single climate catastrophe then becomes a potential liability for anyone and everyone involved in these programs. And because of that, Gary, we have volumes of documents at geoengineeringwatch.org. And one in particular, your listeners can find, it's if they search geoengineeringwatch.org, massive Senate documents, 800 pages long. We've highlighted the most important parts already. But in that document, it specifically calls for blanket legal immunity for anyone and everyone involved in these programs. So they're obviously not going to disclose this. So the stated purpose would imply some sort of benevolence, but we would argue it's anything but. And even the stated purpose is not to actually make better a problem of a damaged planet. It's about hiding that damage. It's about masking that damage. And these particles can create short-term temporary toxic cooldowns at the cost of an even worse warming and damage to the planet. So how is that truly any form of benevolence? And beyond this, I would argue there is no benevolence in these programs, none. We see a systematic targeting of countries, of agricultural regions, including in the US, and we can speculate about the agendas and objectives being carried out. But the fact that agricultural regions, for example, are being systematically targeted is beyond dispute. We can see what's happening on satellite imagery. So yes, the stated purpose, slow down the warming of the planet, but the result we see is absolutely not in that category. And we see a systematic use of these programs for power and control. And let me give one example I know you'd be familiar with, Gary. We have, after 9/11, we had former NATO Supreme Commander General Wesley Clark. Do you remember the list he was given of the countries to be targeted after 9/11? He was given a list of all the Middle Eastern countries to be targeted. A list that clearly appeared to exist before 9/11 even occurred. Remember that?
Right. Yeah, I do.
So what happened to those countries after? You do. That's something I thought you would certainly remember. Every one of those countries subsequently underwent a once in 1,000 year drought. Now, mathematically, statistically, that would be impossible for that kind of consistency. And we have the leaders of those countries, in the case of Iran, on the floor of the UN, stating emphatically, and they have very sophisticated meteorological equipment and satellite imagery. We had the leaders of the countries of Iran on the floor of the UN, on film, on the record, stating NATO was cutting off their precipitation. This is weather warfare. And I stated this in 2014 in a presentation in California. It's called Engineered Drought Catastrophe Target California, that if these programs continue, this is what would happen here. It's exactly what has happened. So the American public can think that their government is here to try to protect and preserve them and their posterity. But we see the same kind of assault happening against our own citizens here. And I would argue that those in control are not elected officials. They're those who print the money, Gary.
Now, the people that are in charge of directing some of this, obviously they have to be able to see some of the same research, some of the same information that you have access to. They're seeing the negative effects in there. Seems like they're cutting off their nose to spite their face. Ultimately, they have to be able to see that. So, what is the explanation for that? What is the justification that they see these negative impacts taking place, but do they just not care? What goal is so important that we're potentially risking millions of lives, not only here in the United States, but across the globe?
Well, this is a very important question. This why would they do this to themselves question.
Sure.
And we can answer that very readily. And if we start with the 2,400 nuclear bombs that have been detonated on the planet, they asked no one's permission to do that. Everyone was contaminated with the fallout from those detonations. Don't they know they work after maybe a few dozen? 2,400. We know from the detonations in Nevada, from peer-reviewed science study now, we know that no less than 500,000 Americans eventually died from the downstream fallout from the Nevada tests, which they told no one about. We have Project Starfish Prime, the detonation of hydrogen bombs in the magnetosphere, and Project Fishbowl. And U.S. government scientists thought that that could collapse the entire atmosphere. Did that stop them? No, it didn't stop them. They did it anyway. And so what I would argue with, and we have psychoanalysis study of those in power, those who crave power. It's an addiction. We all know that. Power is the ultimate addiction for a certain type of individual. And psychoanalysis, this is right from the manual, states that the common thread in these types of individuals is, quote, a near total lack of comprehension as to the consequences of their actions, even to themselves. So what do we see to back that up? We have Fukushima, a triple nuclear meltdown, no technology to fix it, no end in sight. And if that continues, that will likely be an extinction event by itself. Are they stopping the nuclear power plant construction? No, they're building 60 more right now. We already have 442 online. It takes about 2 to 3 decades to cold shut down a nuclear power plant. When society collapses, and it will collapse, fisheries are collapsing around the globe right now. Crops are collapsing around the globe. Ozone layer, in spite of what we've been told, is collapsing right now. We're metering UV. So when there's no one to man those power plants, we're going to have a whole lot of Fukushimas, 100, 200, 300, game over. And everybody's pretending that things are just going to keep chugging along magically like they are. So again, we have many examples of what they in power have done to themselves and continue to do themselves. But I would argue their quest to retain their control is so total that the consequences are not relevant to them. And we have examples of exactly that. So I think we need to rethink who we've allowed to take control in a population that believes that somehow everything will magically work out if they just ignore it long enough. And this story isn't going to end that way.
So when you're talking about how exactly are they trying to control by manipulating the weather? And if you will, real quick, kind of pause on that for a second. And just for everybody and my own clarification too, you talk about geoengineering, kind of that, and kind of talk a little bit about what that means in the different aspects that you're referencing right now.
Now, these are super important questions, Gary. Thank you, because someone with your focus and articulateness made it much more productive to have an exchange. I
think you're being overly generous.
No, I'm not. I'm really not. If I can back up to the first question, that if we look at, have you seen the film of U.S. President Johnson on film on the record in 1962? Have you seen that film clip of him stating that we had the power to control the world's cloud layer then, and quote, he who controls the weather controls the world? Have you seen that?
No, I have not seen that particular clip.
And ultimately, to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
On every weekly broadcast at geoengineeringwatch.org, that's the first 30 seconds of our broadcast. And that's a commercial-free, non-political. We are non-political at geoengineeringwatch.org. I want to stress that. We don't sell anything. So the first 30 seconds of, it's called Global Alert News. I've done that 10 years every week. No exceptions, and that's addressing what's unfolding that week, how it affects our collective immediate future. First 30 seconds is former U.S. President Lyndon Johnson in 1962, on film on the record, ranting like a lunatic, stating, he who controls the weather controls the world, because he who controls the weather controls food supplies, thus controls populations, thus controls the world. So for those who say, why would our government want to manipulate the weather? I would say, why wouldn't our government want to manipulate the weather? Why wouldn't every government want to manipulate the weather? And they all have publicized weather modification operations. And the very premise of this, Gary, should be alarming to people, because even what people know about, and Gary, you know about the publicized cloud seeding operations, right? Everybody's heard of that.
Yes.
You've seen that single engine propeller driven airplane, some flares on the wings.
Yep.
So people accept that as being reality. that this small little aircraft with a few flares in the wings that can maybe distribute 5 or 10 kilos of materials into a cloud that can manipulate the weather. But they don't believe that on an exponentially larger scale, like a KC-135, that can carry 100 tons into the stratosphere and the troposphere at mid latitudes, and the stratosphere at higher latitudes can be as low as 23 feet. So it can carry it into the stratosphere at those higher latitudes. But somehow people don't believe that would be going on. They don't believe the government would do this. And of course they would. This is the crown jewel weapon of the military-industrial complex, or those who control it, while telling our military brothers and sisters, and this is so important, telling our military brothers and sisters that what they're engaged in is some benevolent, necessary, planet-saving operation, which couldn't be further from the truth. And I would argue, just as we had in Vietnam, was the pilot of those C-130s or whatever they were flying there that was dropping Agent Orange on everything, killing civilians and also killing our own soldiers on the ground eventually. And I just lost a good friend, a former veteran that was metering UV for us. He's a former NASA contract engineer. He died. Agent Orange finally caught up to him. But were our pilots told that this will kill your comrade on the ground? Of course not. What about the depleted uranium in the Middle East? Many people don't even know about that. I know you do, but that contaminated all our troops. And I brought, at my expense, I brought the former Marine medic from a family of Marines. I brought him to Northern California to speak multiple times on DU and what it did to our troops. And our troops weren't even told that they were using radioactive ammunition that has a radioactive half-life of 4.5 billion years with a B. They weren't told. So again, what we're trying to do at geoengineeringwatch.org is break that firewall down so that our military brothers and sisters understand they're being compartmentalized, they're being lied to, and what they're engaged in is literally an exercise in self-extermination. And back to the back and control part, again, 62 years ago, President Johnson stating we had the power to control the world's cloud layer then, and he who controls the weather controls the world. How far have they come since then?
Sure. Yeah. I asked you kind of broad term, define for the audience what all bioengineering actually, what it means, what it entails, what it encompasses, just so that everybody has at least a kind of a what you're referencing and what that actually means for first people kind of seeing this information and ultimately, hopefully, doing some research. And folks, we're going to make sure we have a bunch of links down below. You can take a look at the information and you can figure out if it makes sense to you and it's something that is compelling to you. I'll leave it at that. But yeah, if you would, Dane, just kind of define that a little for us.
It means to engineer the planet's life support systems. Is that not the epitome of hubris, to think that you can improve on systems that are so miraculous and so complex? The only thing you can do is disrupt those systems. And the very premise of weather modification or cloud seeding for rain, obviously, if you seed a cloud and you cause rain to fall in one place where it otherwise wouldn't have fallen, it obviously didn't get wherever it was going. How simple is that?
Right.
And the geopolitical ramifications of these programs are immense. These are programs that can start World War III. And although we know we have global cooperation, I want to stress that. I mentioned that our military brothers and sisters are being compartmentalized, certainly, believing they're doing something for the greater good, believing they're following their oath to protect their countrymen from all threats, foreign and domestic, which couldn't be further from the truth. But we also have, Gary, on the record, intergovernmental collusion and cooperation, even between, for example, the US and Russia in the height of the Cold War. Historical record that Soviet weather modification scientists were here in the US touring US weather modification facilities, and our scientists there in the 60s, in the height of the Cold War. So again, this is like mafia that collude and cooperate until a point where there's not enough to go around. And I would argue we're at that point. At this from the last UN conference in New York, stated on the record, I believe the New York Times covered this, that there was great mistrust in the climate meetings because countries have been cooperating in programs. The whole COP climate conferences, Gary, you know what those are? The COP climate conferences. We just had one in Dubai.
I've heard of
those.
It's the global climate.
So what those are is all the countries getting together and pretending that they're going to change business as usual, pretending that they're going to start reducing the atmospheric pollution. But what's really going on at those conferences is behind closed doors. They are forcing nations to either actively or passively participate in these programs. And what happens when nations don't? What happens when they push back? Do you know what happened in Acapulco last October? Hurricane Otis. Did you hear about that by chance?
I remember hearing about Hurricane Otis, but I don't know exactly what happened.
I would recommend, and I'm leading into this intergovernmental cooperation and what happens if a nation starts to drag their feet or push back. Mexico pushed back against the climate engineering operations early in 2023, and they also weren't towing a line with official policy on the Middle East in early 2023. In October of last year, and I would encourage your listeners to search and view the flyover of Acapulco's done. It's never coming back, never. And most Americans don't know that. If you look at the flyover Hurricane Otis, you have to see it to believe it. It looks like something from a post-apocalyptic movie. They're done. What happened there? We had an insignificant tropical depression. This is certainly climate engineering, top to bottom, because they can control atmospheric pressure zones so they can control convection, which supercharges hurricanes. It's called a rapid intensification. You may have heard that term a lot lately, Gary, because they use it all the time now. Because this is how you can manipulate even a storm of that size, when you can control atmospheric pressure zones. And people think you couldn't possibly affect a storm that big because there's so much energy. That's absolute nonsense. I just documented this on my weekly broadcast. One man with the manual rails divert the course of a 10 million pound train. Small input, massive effect. And the same is true. It's proven with the laws of physics and weather modification research. As a storm is forming, small input can have massive effects. So Hurricane Otis, Acapulco, insignificant tropical depression, no warnings to Acapulco, went to the strongest Cat 5 hurricane to ever hit that part of the world in less than 24 hours. It's never happened before. Meteorologists are still scratching their heads. This is weather warfare. It's absolutely weather warfare. So again, this is a weapon with which they can bring nations and populations to their knees without either of those knowing they're even under assault. Blame it on nature. So, and if we look at, again, the term, back to your original question, this is manipulating and hijacking the planet's life support systems. That's what geoengineering is. The term is a bit confusing. People think it's some sort of term that applies to geology, or no, that applies to engineering the Earth's life support systems. And for people that think that they wouldn't do this, they've already proven they would. Project Starfish Prime, hydrogen bombs in the magnetosphere, we're still dealing with the repercussions for that. And now we have a very damaged atmosphere. Now we're very susceptible to a coronal mass ejection or a solar flare. Now we have the aurora borealis, which is happening a lot lately, isn't it? Gary, have you seen any of the aurora effect where you're at?
Not here, but again, they've been.
Let's add HARP. Yeah, and you know to add another layer that you from HARP, you probably know what that is. The facility in Alaska. So the acronym doesn't mean anything. It's meant to be confusing, just like the geoengineering term. High Altitude Active Auroral Research Program. What is it? It's a weapon of mass destruction. It's an ionosphere heater. So they can steer 3.6 million watts of power into the electrically charged ionosphere and cause an electrical chain reaction. And that superheats a huge section of the atmosphere. Again, small input, massive output. And that heating causes the atmosphere to expand up and down. The stated defense purpose for doing so is to create resistance for an incoming ICBM to burn it up in the atmosphere. The actual use of this, the downward push of the atmosphere, creates a heat dome or a high pressure dome, which helps to steer the jet stream. And even the patent holder, Bernard Eastland, stated this on the record. It was even on a Discovery Channel documentary called Owning the Weather, which they have tried to put in the closet now. They don't want people to see that. So they can literally steer the jet stream with these types of frequency weapons. So again, any country that we see pushing back and not towing the line, something bad seems to happen to them, Gary. And again, this is coming to a head. We're at the point where the mafia families are beginning to infight. We don't know who's tugging and pulling on what part of the atmosphere now to do what. This is a very dangerous road we're on. And to put this into perspective, the atmosphere proportionally is as thin as a layer of paint on a basketball. That's what allows us to live here, and we're destroying it.
So when we have, obviously we have some pretty powerful adversaries, if you will, that we're talking about, China, Russia, and many others, Iran. Why? I know you mentioned how Iran stated that their weather was being manipulated by with and through.
Yes.
Why haven't we heard these other countries speak out, and what are they doing to combat this? Or Or is this some sort of like global cabal? Like they're all, you mentioned they're kind of cahoots. You know, what does that mean? Because obviously if we're manipulating, we have that ability, we have the ability to control their, like that's where we can use as a weapon. And what are they doing to combat that? And why haven't we heard more of that?
It's another great question. And as I mentioned, we did hear about it after 9/11 on the floor of the UN. It just wasn't publicized here in the US. Listeners can find that film. They can find the film of Ahmadinejad on the floor of the UN stating NATO was cutting the precipitation off of Iran, thus affecting their food supplies, thus affecting their populations, thus helping to destabilize their nation. And we would argue the same has been occurring in Africa for decades, which is why AFRICOM has such a footprint in Africa, because governments are forced to allow that occupation or their weather goes very wrong very quickly. This covert weapon, again, crown jewel of the military-industrial complex. In the case of why now do we not see them speaking out, it's hard to know how much collusion and cooperation is going on behind the curtain, even between otherwise adversarial nations. Again, we know they've been colluding and cooperating on climate engineering without question. And this is something that would be, from an analytical standpoint, more in your wheelhouse than mine, Gary, but we certainly see conflicts even like Ukraine, which certainly would involve an adversarial relationship between the US and Russia. And those open fields with artillery everywhere. And I mean, it seems to us that a single fighter jet could lay waste to any of those installations anytime they want, but they don't. It's like a measured meat grinder battlefield that everybody allows to just keep going. And in the case of Iran, and yes, Israel bombed them first, but why would they strike back with meaningless missiles that they know are going to be shot down, just giving a premise for even more war? We see both sides seeming to participate in this theater to escalate conflict, which the military-industrial complex exists for. No conflict, they not exist any longer. So it's impossible for us to know what kind of tit-for-tat collusion and cooperation goes on behind the scenes. Again, in the case of Iran, we know we had open pushback to these programs. Mexico started to do the same, and we saw what happened to them. We saw what happened to Turkey, and this is another layer. You remember when Turkey pushed back against the UN? Remember that? Turkey, no, and remember the swarm of earthquakes?
I do remember earthquakes. Yes.
Turkey basically told, 5 days before that swarm of quakes, Turkey basically the middle finger to the UN. Is it just a coincidence that a swarm of quakes then devastated Turkey? Now, that's a whole nother subject, the tectonic weaponry. And this is, again, it's scientifically not disputed. What happens when you can bounce a microwave signal off the atmosphere and back down into seismically sensitive strata, what will happen? And I would ask this: if you search MIT atmospheric earthquake, you'll find MIT stating on the record that for 3 days prior to that quake, there was what they called extremely anomalous atmospheric heating above the epicenter, which they cannot explain. Now, again, when you can bounce a microwave signal off a now reflective atmosphere and back down into the strata, and these installations like HARP are directional, you can steer that transmission. And there's about 100 more atmosphere heaters around the globe. It's not just HARP. So again, then we'd have to ask, well, why would, if the U.S. or whatever other country was involved with this, and the U.S. in particular with the biggest ionosphere heater, why would they do this to Japan? I can tell you what I was told by General Albert Stubblebine, highest-ranking U.S. military general to ever speak out about what really happened on 9/11. He was a personal friend of mine. What General Stubblebine told me was that Japan was beginning to ally with its regional partners. The U.S. didn't want that, and that was a shot across their bow. And when you trigger a 9.0 earthquake, bad things happen. He told me the Fukushima meltdown was not intended. It was a consequence. But whatever the case, whatever the agendas, whatever happened, when we have institutions like MIT stating that there was extremely anomalous atmospheric heating above the epicenter, explain that for me. Somebody find a plausible explanation, and not that the pressure's building up on the tectonic plate so it somehow heats the atmosphere. That is absolutely scientifically completely ludicrous. When we have technology we know would have that exact effect in bouncing that signal off the atmosphere. And we know even things like fracking. Gary, you've heard of fracking earthquakes, right?
Sure.
You've heard fracking causes quakes. And so the documentation on what happens when you send that kind of signal into seismically sensitive strata is very well documented. Even very low power surveying equipment does exactly the same. So what happens when you turn a weapon like HARP loose on that kind of strata? And if we have other, I know I'm kind of diverging here a bit, but I want to point out that the depth of what's occurring that people have never even contemplated. Is it just a coincidence? During a presidential election, John Kerry flew to Antarctica during the election of which he was a part. There is an ionosphere heater in Antarctica. That's not disputed. He flew back to Christchurch, New Zealand during the presidential election, pulled all the U.S. diplomats out. 4 hours later, massive earthquake hits Christchurch. Is that just a coincidence? Same thing happened during the Clinton administration in Haiti. Pulled diplomats out of Haiti, and Haiti gets wiped out with an earthquake within hours. Is that just a coincidence? Christchurch, New Zealand, New Zealand in general, in the hip pocket of Western powers point. So is it this bad? And why would they be this desperate to have such total control? And I would argue that here's the part the population doesn't want to know. None of us want to know. The planet can't support this paradigm any longer. Our life support systems are imploding. Climate engineering, a big part of that, but not the only part. And this is where, Gary, a lot of people online don't want to admit to this. They want to pretend there's no problem with the planet. Even those who acknowledge climate engineering want to pretend that climate engineering is the only problem. Without that, we'd all live happily ever after. And that's not true. It's a complex equation. Anything we do that damages the planet's life support system is a part of the problem. So you've heard all these narratives, right?
Sure.
So what we try to do at geoengineeringwatch.org is build a bridge and say this: no legitimate discussion about climate anything from any perspective without addressing this issue first.
So let's talk about, we've touched on some of the things that they're doing specifically. And what I want to do is be able to give, besides, definitely going to link the movie, The Dimming, that you sent to me. It was actually, that was originally sent to me by another viewer. And again, it was preceded by an email that I really did blow off. I've told you, when it came to, I believe that our government is very conspiratorial. They're working against us many different ways, and some of those ways you've already touched on. When 9/11 happened, looking back at the service, sacrifice, the reasons I was willing to go to war and ultimately lost friends. At the end of the day, I look back and I realized, we were definitely manipulated. And as proud as I am of my service and my brothers in arms, their service and their sacrifice at the same time, there's parts of me that look at it as a waste, and we were just naive. So, what are some of the specific things that people can look up? And because, as I was stating right there, the big thing with that, I know our government can manipulate and do things that are definitely not in our interest, and disguise it, hide it, and everything else. And we can look back at many, you've already touched on some of the projects going back, and there's many more projects that the CIA and other government entities have been involved in and are continuing to be involved in that are not in our best interest, to say the least. But at the same time, I guess what are some of the things that specifically chemtrails, we touched on different systems, this is, for me, and I know a lot of people out there, almost a bridge too far. And that's what I've told you, that, I believe in a lot of things. I don't believe in this chemtrail thing. I don't believe in the weather manipulation thing. And I'll be honest with you, some of the things that you've presented to me and some of the evidence that's presented in The Dimming and some of the other links that you've sent to me are pretty hard to deny. It's some pretty compelling evidence. So, if you will, just, I guess, kind of fill in the audience of the systems that they're using in geoengineer currently, and what those look like, and then ultimately what they're doing to our planet, to our ecosystem, and kind of go from there.
I'll definitely fill in that blank. How long were you in the service?
I was in the service from 2002 until to 2012.
That's a long time. And I want to say this to our military brothers and sisters, that I know clearly, and even the short dialogue I've had with you, and what you did was out of honorable motives. And I recognize that. And I recognize that with all our service members. I gave to DAV for about 20 years, VFW for about 20 years. I worked as a volunteer with Vietnam vets that were twisted shells of men, and my heart bleeds for them. And I know what they did was out of absolutely honorable motives, and I respect and revere that. But I would also argue that we need to disclose the fact that they were being used as cannon fodder, and that needs to come to light. They deserve that truth. And now the American public is in the same category. And I would argue that we need to consider the American population is not just expendable to those who truly control the levers of power, but a rapidly increasing liability, and especially people that are so capable of defending themselves, like you or our other former military brothers and sisters, or the armed civilians in this country more than any other country. That's a rapidly increasing liability. Why would U.S. agencies like Homeland Security purchase 2.4 billion rounds of 40 caliber hollow point in 2012? Why? For what purpose? Is that plan B or C if plan A doesn't work within the herd? Why in 2010 would the U.S. Census Bureau hike into everybody's doorstep? I live in a very remote location. They hiked behind a mile of locked gate to GPS my doorstep, not once, but twice. Why? Why did they need to GPS my doorstep? And I called the Census Bureau a dozen times, could not get a straight answer. So again, I would argue they've been preparing for this for a very long time. They've known that this course would bring us to a point where the planet's life support systems would not support populations any longer. And they've been preparing for a very long time, stocking up underground facilities. We know that was happening because we contacted one of the largest freeze-dried food manufacturers on the planet that was off retail for a very long time, and they told us they were supplying government bunkers. So again, everybody's asleep at the wheel, Gary, I would argue. And for what's happening now to the U.S. population, what better way to mire the population in misery and difficulty, preventing them from even looking at the wider horizon, let alone doing anything about it, inflict natural disasters, blame nature. So let's look at Hurricane Helene, if we can. Have you by chance seen the 90-second video we recorded of her steering Helene?
No, I don't think I have, to be honest with you, Dan.
I would really recommend looking at that, because that's what really in the last few weeks blew open this issue in so many ways. We have congressmen calling us daily from North Carolina, South Carolina, Connecticut, Tennessee. We recorded the frequency transmissions that steered Helene in real time. And you don't need to know anything about meteorology to recognize what's occurring there. The NextRad network of frequency transmissions that we are told are just radar facilities, just like we're told HAARP is a harmless atmospheric research station. But by the way, I forgot to mention on the Aurora Borealis part on HAARP in the May Aurora Borealis event, is it just a coincidence that 10 days before that event, the HAARP facility gave warnings to the FAA to keep aircraft out of its airspace during that event, 10 days ahead of time? Is that just a coincidence? Or is this weapon that capable of causing such a chain reaction in the atmosphere that we have no idea what they're doing at this point? So the bottom line is that we recorded not just Helene, we recorded Hurricane Ian, Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Harvey. You might remember Hurricane Harvey, that somehow the meteorologists knew 7 days in advance that it would go where it did and sit there for days, dumping 50 inches of rain. And we recorded, again, the actual transmissions and their impact on those circulations. And we know from these patented processes, it has a repelling effect on the air mass, and thus they can, in that manner, steer the storms. And that's why we see so much, quote, rapid intensification now, because they, for your listeners who don't know, the U.S. military started hurricane modification, experimentation, and operations in 1947, Project Cirrus. And to give an example of how a small input has a massive output, they dumped 80 pounds of dry ice into that storm. And according to all the meteorology at the time, that storm changed direction by 130 degrees and stayed harmlessly out to sea, made impact in Georgia, doing immense damage. And lawsuits were threatened, and there was huge pushback, at which time suddenly the whole story changed. No, it wasn't us. Just a coincidence. Nothing to see here. Move along. And then the program seemed to go underground. And this is much like, do you remember the recent rains in Dubai, Gary?
I do.
The floods in Dubai, they got two years worth of rain in 6 hours. Is it a coincidence that days before Dubai openly stated they were going to ditch the US dollar? Is that just a coincidence? If it's a coincidence, why were there radio frequency transmission signatures on the clouds in the Persian Gulf? And we recorded that from satellite imagery at Geoengineering Watch. In the Persian Gulf, the day before and the day of that event, there were frequency signatures. They initially announced that they were conducting weather mod operations during that event, and then they backtracked it. Do you remember that? They completely backtracked after the blowback started to occur from the admission of weather mod operations. So they simply changed the narrative. And people don't want to believe it. As you said, it's a bridge too far. They accept the official narrative. They don't do any research. We have instance after, I mean, there's so much satellite imagery. There's so much inarguable data records. Project Popeye in Vietnam. You've heard of that one, I'm sure. Project Popeye was the weather mod in Vietnam, publicized matter of historical record that was so effective. Project Popeye, Vietnam. The U.S. military was so effective at controlling precipitation that in 1976, international governments passed INMOD treaties, environmental modification treaties, forbidding weather manipulation in wartime. That's how effective they were. And yet we have today a total denial that this can even be done. At the same time, we have, Gary, have you had any of these circumstances where you're at, where it goes from degrees, plunges 50 degrees in a day, or from high temperatures to snow in a day or two? Or have you had any of that happen where you're, I'm not sure you're exactly.
Days. It was, down in the 40s and then, 80s.
Okay. This is a massive harbinger of climate intervention operations. So chemical weather modification, that's seeding the clouds with patented processes of endothermic reacting elements. People know, you can have a first aid kit in your shelf for 20 years, right, with a cold pack in it. You mix those cold pack chemicals, you have ice instantly.
Sure. Yep.
That's what's happening on a massive scale. And these processes are toxic. And we have the Chinese government, for example, openly announcing they're doing this. Everybody covered it. Your listeners can search Chinese scientists create artificial snowstorm. Popular Science covered it. The Guardian, CNN, MSNBC, everybody covered it. But if you bring that up here, we even have President Biden saying, absurd, can't happen. Nobody can do this. We have CNN doing hit pieces on, for example, they just did a hit piece on myself and Alex Jones for discussing this issue. And they have time to do this, to do a hit piece to say geoengineering is a conspiracy theory. How can they say that? The whole climate science community is discussing exactly what we see happening in our skies. Every government around the globe is saying, but they're not admitting these programs are ongoing. And we have the matrix media just pumping out this narrative of just conspiracy theory, nothing to see here. We better wake the hell up, because this is.
You can Google geoengineering. You can see that there are very prominent different everything from, I'm just looking at the Google right now. We got MIT technology right now. What is geoengineering and why should you care? It's becoming clear that we won't cut carbon emissions soon enough to prevent catastrophic climate change, going on and on. Nature.com, geoengineering and environmental ethics, and many, many more. So it is clearly happening. That was one of the things when I first kind of put onto this story and put onto, quite frankly, your Twitter feed and some other links that I was sent, and started looking into this and trying to research this. One of the things that I was very aware of is there's that same fingerprint of cover up and disinformation that I think most people with any sort of awareness can see that we experienced definitely through COVID. I think COVID definitely opened my eyes, and I think many Americans' eyes, and hopefully people all over the world, at what our government is willing to do to manipulate people at scale. And I also think that, COVID was one of these, it was a test run of something. Really do think that was used for. But even going back to the weather and the different weather events that we've clearly been having over the years, I've about climate change for a long time, and obviously the climate does. There's some pretty good scientific evidence that there's some warming, and I'll leave it at that. I'm not a climate scientist, but what I also have always noticed, the thing that's really put me off to the climate change bandwagon, is I've also seen that used as a manipulation for people to vote a certain way, to push people towards certain policies. And, the more that I think about this and some of the things that you're saying is, it's the fireman that's also the arsonist. I definitely see where, if 1/10 of what you're saying is, we have scientists and we have government entities that have some control of the weather, where they can manipulate people into believing something or to show them proof of something. Because at the end of the day, the climate change movement does seem very socialist, very communist, and very controlling in nature. And that's one of the things that, you know, whether you want to call me or anybody else a climate change denier, it's not denying that climate change isn't taking place. It's the answer and the policies that you're justifying through this that doesn't make sense to me. Just like we talked about, hey, you know what? We have this global warming thing. Everybody needs to live in cities. Everybody needs to drive EVs. Well, that doesn't make sense. Everybody needs to have solar panels. Everybody needs this. And it is a method of which the government is using to control people. And it's one of those things that I just look at and I can't quite put my finger on the exact thing, but I know it's bad. It's like, that doesn't look right to me. And I guess a little bit more of what you're saying provides me a little clarity, because they can create the conditions that they want, that helps them control and push people in a certain direction.
We are on exactly the same page on everything you just stated. First, if we can go back to the COVID scenario.
Sure.
I completely concur. That was, well, I don't want to call it a dry run, because there are dire consequences from what has already been done. Incredibly dry. But you're correct, and I do agree with you that is still a form of test for likely much worse coming. In our precipitation right now, from hundreds of lab tests, we've worked with the University of Minnesota in the PhDs who work there. The PhDs, he's since gone underground. He's like so many others. They're trying to protect their paychecks and pensions as if that matters on the Titanic. You can't hide in your cabin on the Titanic. The ship's going down. You need to be on deck trying to help. But we've had so many people, they duck and run, thinking somehow that will exempt them from what's coming. So we've done hundreds of lab tests in Minnesota. We've paid a lot for some of those tests. We have graphene and polymer fibers in our rain. Now, those are listed in climate engineering patents for chemical ice nucleation and other patents, but those two elements are also used as biological carrier platforms. What's that mean? It means to carry a pathogen from the clouds to the ground. What's that doing in our rain? That's what they're used militarily for. When we have the world's second most recognized climate engineer, Dr. Ken Caldera, and we own an audio of him stating on the record what he did for the DoD, Department of Defense, to design ways of spraying pathogens into clouds to infect the populations below. On the outbreaks of COVID, we had one wave of 85 countries infected in 3 days. That's indicative of an airborne dispersion. We have Italian researchers that found CV19 attached to airborne particulates. Why would we think they're not doing this when, as far back as 1977, the Washington Post published that as of record, the U.S. military had already conducted no less than 239 open-air biological tests on innocent, unknowing U.S. civilians. This is business as usual. In regard to the state of the climate, and this is where it's very important that, and I agree there's disaster capitalism going on here, Gary. There's no question. We have those making money off this, from everybody from Monsanto that's engineering aluminum-resistant seeds, because aluminum's in our rain. It's toxic to all life forms, period, no exceptions, including root systems. So they're engineering aluminum-resistant seeds, UV-resistant seeds, trying to capitalize off the cataclysm. And we have crop futures for crops that are being wiped out all over the country. People are capitalizing off the market with the futures. I mean, we had the same thing in 11 with the put options. You might remember that. You knew it was coming. But I would, again, encourage people to think about the fact that just because someone's making money off something doesn't mean the disaster isn't real. We have entities making money off both sides of conflicts. Does that mean the war didn't happen? Does that mean people didn't die? If we look at Prescott Bush, Granddad Bush, there was congressional hearings in the 40s because he was making money off both sides of the conflict. How many Americans even know that? So again, we have no shortage of disaster capitalists and those who would profit off calamity, but that doesn't mean the calamity isn't real. And in regard to the population, the power structure has very successfully, you're very correct at this attempt to manipulate from the green, quote, green community that won't admit to climate engineering, because they've been programmed and they're controlled with their 501c3 nonprofit, by the way, completely controlled, as are many of the spiritual institutions. They're told what they can address and what they can't. I know this, and our attorneys at Geoengineering Watch have talked to the attorneys from all the major environmental groups, WWF, Greenpeace, Sierra Club, all of them. They won't address climate engineering because they don't want to lose their 501 nonprofit. So the power structure has very successfully driven a wedge into society so that those on the left and the environmental communities are trained. If somebody mentions geoengineering, they must be a climate denier, so ignore everything they say and deny climate engineering. And on the other side, they've successfully driven that wedge into people to believe that Al Gore is such a hypocrite, and he is. All of us love to hate Al Gore or the rest that fly their private jets to these climate conferences, and the hypocrisy is immense. So they've been trained to ignore everything that side says, so therefore there must not be any damage to the planet. So we have this massive divide, and nobody coming together in the middle saying, hey, okay, we recognize we've been poor stewards of the planet, but the biggest source of damage is climate, and we need to face and address that, which is also biological warfare. So again, this is the biggest hole in the bottom of the boat at this moment, Gary, and that's why we're focused on it.
It's a lot to take in, Dane. It's a lot to digest. There's no doubt about that. Well, let me ask you this. You know, there's some pretty intelligent folks out there that pay attention to these type of things. You know, the couple of guys that come to mind right now that you would be speaking on this issue that I would have to imagine know about this issue. You know, Elon Musk or RFK. You know, where are they in all of this? And Elon Musk, if you're putting space, you're putting rockets in space, you got pretty aware of the environment. You got to be pretty aware of our atmosphere and what's going on, and you know, everything from taking samples and doing scientific studies. Where do you think guys like them kind of all this?
Have you by chance seen Robert Kennedy's 1-hour interview with me?
Not. I have not.
Yeah, I was interviewed by Robert for an hour. Easy to find online. You can find it on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org. And he was more or less leaned on, not more or less, he was leaned on to conduct that interview with me by some important people, because they called me as well. And they wanted that interview done. And he did it. And to Robert's credit, I was scheduled to interview with him again the week before last. And they had to reschedule one day. And then the next rescheduled, his mother died. You remember that? She just died.
Yeah, I did.
So we rescheduled again. I hope that interview takes place, because a follow-up interview would be very important. And I don't know if you saw Robert's tweets. He's tweeted twice now that he will address this issue if he is a part of the incoming administration. If he's with Trump, he said he would address this issue. Now, I want to believe that. I know those in power. What happened to John F. Kennedy when he drew a line in the sand with those in power? He lived, what, a week? So again, I would argue the last person to actually draw a line in the sand with the power structure was JFK, and he didn't live long afterward. In regard to Elon Musk, and I know as far as Mr. Trump goes, I've had a conference call with Marla Maples, his ex, others that work with Mr. Trump. They certainly know. We've supplied them materials, they know. And many congressmen know, and are circulating our printed materials throughout DC. This fire is growing very rapidly. In regard to Elon, and there are mutual contacts trying to get him to address the issue also, but there's a massive conflict of interest, isn't there, with the whole EV vehicle scenario. If populations understood the gravity and immediacy of what's unfolding, this current paradigm is done. It's over. It's in its death throes. It's circling the drain. I know how bitter a pill it is and how unpopular that is. Everybody wants to think if we just do A, B, and C, everything will work out and we'll have endless Disney World vacations and Caribbean cruises, and that's not going to happen. I can assure you that's not going to happen. If at best we're going to salvage some part of the planet's life support systems, but much of what Musk does are not beneficial to the human race or what's left of the planet.
Well, that's why he's trying to get off the planet, I think.
There you go. There you go. Why is Zuckerberg has $100 million bunker in Hawaii? Do you know that?
I didn't know that, but I know that Elon Musk definitely has a couple of bunkers in plenty of places. I don't doubt that. As a matter of fact, he'd be an idiot not to. But you know, the other thing that I am vividly aware of is that he is very reliant on for multiple contracts, obviously, and even to be able to own space program. I mean, that is through the U.S. government. So I don't think he's above being manipulated, or I wouldn't call it blackmailed, but definitely leaned on and pressed. So, you know, I've always understood Elon, and often I hear the same question asked, well, why isn't Elon doing this? Why isn't Elon doing this? Very similar to what I just asked you. And the fact of the matter is that he has a lot of eggs in the government basket, and I'm going to be getting off here, and I know late here, but I'm going to be definitely pulling up your interview with RFK. I'm very excited to hear that. I'd love to hear what he has to say about that issue for sure.
If a couple of points I could make clear, because these are big red flags. There's an illegal federal gag order right now on all National Weather Service and NOAA employees, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, on all agency operations. And that gag order was sent to geoengineeringwatch.org when it first happened in an unmarked envelope, so we would get heads up on it. Why in the world would you need to gag the nation's weathermen if there wasn't something massive to hide? And people, there's those online that will deny this, saying there's no gag order on geoengineering. We never claimed there's a gag order specifically on geoengineering. That would be an even bigger red flag, wouldn't it? It's a gag order on all agency operations. I've had a NOAA scientist state to my face, quote, this is the Marine Lab on the West Coast, stated to my face, private meeting, we all know what's going on. We have no First Amendment protection. We don't know what to do. In a meeting with Governor Gavin Newsom in his office at the Capitol with his top aide, was arranged for me by some important people. He couldn't deny the data. His top aide there again, they couldn't deny anything I was presenting. Have we heard anything from him? No, because he's a tool of the matrix. That's exactly what he is. I've spoken in front of the California Energy Commission with their top scientists. This is going back a decade and a half. They recognized they were losing 20 to 40% of the state's rainfall from, quote, particulates of unknown origin. When you're losing 20 to 40% of the rainfall, that's a hell of a lot of particulates in the atmosphere. You should know where they're coming from. And by the way, what those particulates do is if they're too small, there's too many condensation nuclei. So the droplets don't combine and fall as rain. You get these days and days of featureless skies with nothing falling out. And that's solar radiation management. We see in some of the incoming moisture from the Pacific where they're heavily seeding, we'll see a dozen of the western states in the U.S. covered with cloud canopy and nothing falling out. That's not nature. What's wrong with that picture? So at this energy meeting, the California Energy Commission, at that meeting, they voted for and approved the purchase of a $250,000, I believe, spectrometer from Scripps Institute to determine the chemical composition and origin of these particulates. That meter has never been seen or heard from since. Gone. So again, the system's been designed to mask these programs. They've been operational for many decades. They were deployed initially right after World War II over the polar regions. They had a very profound effect until the negative consequences really began to kick in. And if I get into with this, Gary, I know you have, it's late there, but I want to point out how severe our situation is statistically and mathematically. We're down to, based on our metering of the ozone layer from a very qualified U.S. veteran, former NASA contract engineer, metering UV for us, about 30% of the ozone layer is remaining. Not 30% gone, 30% remaining. No ozone layer, no terrestrial life on Earth. You don't vaporize overnight, but you can't grow food anymore. Can't really be outside in this. And the plankton is dying off because they feed in the upper layers of the water column to photosynthesize, and they're being fried. And there's other sources of plankton death, not denying that, nuclear waste in the ocean and toxic everything. And we're not denying that, but we're saying, what's this elephant in the equation that's even bigger than all that combined? We have peer-reviewed study from the Atlantic on plankton populations measured in 500 locations, 90% decline, 90. That's the largest oxygen produced on the planet. They're gone. We just got studies last week, and what we stated at Geoengineering Watch for a decade and a half, that the forests are no longer absorbing carbon. They're not respirating. Between the UV, the toxic rain, killing soil microbiome, killing root systems. And now we have, and you can search this, that there was basically no CO2 uptake last year from the forests. That should be headlines everywhere. Where's the news on that? We're watching political theater. Global insect populations at geoengineeringwatch.org, we published in 2012 that insect populations were crashing based on our work with former government scientists. We were marginalized by the so-called science community. They've since admitted what we stated, not because they want to tell the truth, but because they can't hide it any longer. Insect apocalypse, search that title. You'll find corroboration of what I'm stating. So how long are we going to live if the insects can't survive? Global pelagic fish populations down 90%. That's the food fish. And we have crops collapsing all over the world. And here's my point. What happens when the food shelves empty out? It's already occurring in about 36 countries around the globe, following in the footsteps of Haiti, which is a Mad Max scenario right now. So Americans that think somehow, as long as Walmart's open and Costco's open, that everything will be fine, good luck with that.
Yeah, good luck indeed. Yeah, I think one of the things you touched on almost indirectly is folks, you know, you got there and you got to make sure that you are taking care of, you are self-reliant. And, you know, that's what this channel is all about. That's what Paramount Tactical Solutions is all about. You're responsible for your safety, your well-being, your food, you know, whether it's this issue or a thousand other catastrophes that we are now facing because of different problems from a climate perspective, but also a military threat, because, you know, we have a bunch of politicians that are playing around with starting World War III. So
yes,
it is a lot to take in. Well, listen, Dave, number one, I just want to tell you, thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for being so passionate about this issue. You know, I can tell that you are very steeped in this. You've been doing this for a long time, very articulate, cover a lot of information in a very quick and efficient way. For those of you watching, I think if you're like me that was very skeptical, I think that's good. We all need to be skeptical of anything we're told, but get out there, do some research, and, you know, come to your own conclusions. You know, that's what it's all about. Listen, Dave, I appreciate your time. And yeah, as a matter of fact, hopefully we can do this again in the near future. I'm going to go do watch some of those different videos that you discussed. And yeah, let's touch base another time in the near future.
Anytime, Gary, anytime. Thank you very much for taking the time, and again, voices like yours that are analytical, articulate. It's so a dissemination of this issue. So thank you.
Well, thank you. All right. Well, we will talk again soon. And yeah, you'll be hearing from me. So thank you for coming on. We appreciate it.
My pleasure, Gary. Have a good night.
You as well, man.
Take care.
Bye-bye.